So we've heard about the context and the future that's coming, but let's just think practically now about what we actually have to do, both to identify growth, so how do we actually find that uncomfortable growth today, and also to unlock that growth. So how do we organise ourselves better to win in the context that we face today and in the future, as Walker has illustrated for us. So what we're going to do in this session, I'm conscious that quite a lot of you have been sitting for a while, we're going to do share a bit more data and insight from this enormous study, which I'll explain in more detail in a minute. We're going to do that quickly. That'll be 20 minutes of myself and my colleague, who I'll introduce in a second. And then what we're going to do, which is the bit I'm really excited about, is have a discussion. And I have some very special guests who will be joining me on stage to have a discussion about really the practical experience of what does doing some of this look like and feel like, and what are the barriers, and how do you get started. I'm going to invite you in the middle, well, attempt to do a poll. So just before the panel starts, I'm going to ask you 2 questions about how you think your organisation is doing at finding growth and unlocking it, okay? I will brief you when we come to the right time. I'll walk you through it. The Slido details are up there behind us, or behind me, rather. So yes, some participation. You can also send some questions in. We'll be moderating that, but we will put some of them forward in the panel discussion as well. Without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague, somebody I've learned a huge amount from. He's our world expert in how organisations structure themselves and build their capabilities to win in the current world. Mark Visser. So I'm going to actually start. We're going to just set some context. So Walker's painted the picture of the future, but right now we know the reason we started this study a year ago, which I will say is the single biggest study that Kantar and WPP have ever done into the topic of growth. And the reason we did that is because we saw that the rules, the old rules we've all relied on, our clients have relied on to drive growth, don't work anymore. Zero-based budgeting lost its shine, and on top of that, we also saw the global economy slowing at a rate far faster than any of us expected. The Economist coined the phrase globalization, which I think says it all really. We also know, we saw this firsthand, for lots of our clients struggling with new players entering, breaking the rules because they didn't have the old structures and KPIs to adhere to that existing businesses had. We also know that the war on talent has made it really difficult to catch up or overtake those new entrants that are catching everyone out. And even for those that we work with where they have experienced growth, they have found growth where others haven't, actually they've come under fire for that speed of growth affecting the way they operate and the way that they build their corporate culture. So they've even been feeling, even the fast-growing businesses have been feeling the pressure. Whether they're an overperforming business or an underperforming business, the other thing that we know is that all of us, as marketeers, all of you in this room, I'm sure, and consumers, have a new expectation of brands as to the impact that they have on the world. Not just for us today, but for our children and our children's children. And that's why we decided to do this piece of work. The work, I'm going to talk you through these in just a minute, but what we did was a huge study that landed on these 7 building blocks of growth that Walker set up so wonderfully for us. They cover the what, the how, and the why of growth. And together they form a really nice framework to help you think about how and where to find your growth. Now, what we did, we followed a similar format. It's a tried and tested approach. Many of you will have seen us use on Marketing 2020 or Insight 2020, which Mark, I'm sure, will reference in a bit. And as Walker said, that split up what overperformers were doing and how they perform against a load of metrics that we looked at, versus what underperformers are doing. When I say that, I mean overperformers or underperformers in growth. So companies that are overperforming have had 3 consecutive years of growth as a minimum. Okay, years of growth above the category, although a lot of categories actually have been in decline. We did a load of interviews, nearly 600 interviews with leaders around the world. We also did a survey with 1,500 experts and people from the industry. We used an AI robot to analyse everything that's ever been written about growth in the last 6 years. And we did a brilliant piece of analytics with one of our partners, LinkedIn, which, again, we might touch on later, where we looked at the networks and patterns of people. And again, we can split the overperformers from the underperformers there. We also had a huge advisory board who challenged and built with us along the way. And it's really been, you know, when they say it takes a village, it really has been that way to build this piece of work. Now, we are going to deep dive into 2 of these building blocks in more detail and focus our conversation around those. But before we do, I thought I'd give you a headline of the whole thing. And again, we're happy to talk, you know, outside about any of these things. I'm going to try and do this in about 60 seconds. This is normally a 1-hour presentation, okay? So let's go. Abundant markets, which we'll come into in more depth, is about how you reframe the way you define the market that you're in to find more room for growth. The next one, which is another what to do, so abundant markets is a what, is multiple models. So multiple models is where we see overperformers employing multiple business models. PepsiCo bought SodaStream, Coca-Cola bought Costa Coffee. This is both examples of that in action. Evolving experiences Walker's talked to. It's about overperformers really focusing on building new experiences at the same time as restlessly evolving the existing. It's about embracing the always beautifully dissatisfied, as Jeff Bezos put it. So those are our 3 whats. Our 3 hows of growth. Open culture is about where we see overperformers tackling this myth that our cultural code cannot be rewritten. It can, and we're seeing overperformers rewriting their cultural script. Anticipative organisation we're going to come on to in more depth. That's about agility, fluidity, and entrepreneurialism being key to success with our overperformers and the way they organise. Whole-brained is about how overperformers are balancing better than anybody else the combination of left brain and right brain talent and the combination of data and analytics with creativity. And finally, there's 1 why. And this again talks to a lot of what Walker pointed to coming in the future. Why we do this, why we all come to work every day, and why the people in our organisations do too. And we're seeing overperformers now putting alongside profitability and revenue measures, people metrics about how people feel in the business, and also how they feel about the impact that the business is having on the world. Okay, and that's really what we call humanised growth. Whether that was 60 seconds or not, I don't know, but that's the 7 for you. Now, why are we going to focus on 2? Well, I'll tell you, when we looked at the survey results and we saw that the correlation between the overperformers and the responses, today there are 2 that are responsible for most of the overperformers and their distinction from underperformers. And you can see those there, abundant markets and anticipative organisations. So let's go into the first one. I'll do this quickly. I think I'll let Mark spend a bit more time on the other one because it's very interesting. Each of these follows the same structure. There's a myth, there's some data points, there's a case study, and then there's some actions. So trying to get quite practical for you now. The myth here with abundant markets is that growth is about winning market share from our competitors, because for overperformers, it isn't. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about an interview, one of those 500 depth interviews that we did with leaders from different organisations. And he was a general manager from a personal care business in a market. And he said, my team came into me last week and they were really looking pleased with themselves. I said, what's going on, guys? They said, oh, we just hit 27% market share. We're super happy. Yes. And he sort of rained on their parade a little bit by saying that there were two issues with that. One is when you've got 27% market share, the risk is you sit on your laurels, and where are you going to find more room for growth? And the other issue, he said, really is that in this case it was Nielsen, could easily have been our Well panel team. Actually, what they've told you is what we told them. They've defined the market as shampoos and conditioners of a certain size available in certain channels. And is that really a true reflection of reality today? No. Just after that, the Amazon team went in to see them and said, actually, your market share is 11%. And Amazon sells everything that anybody's going to spend money on. I would argue that's a more true reflection of the market today, or perhaps you need to consider both. And they really actually thought that was great and added value. They took it a step further by saying, can we also look at Kickstarter? So if we imagine Kickstarter as the market of the future, right? So Kickstarter is going to tell us what's coming next, what people are investing behind, and what's getting energy in our category, what are our competitors of tomorrow going to be. And when they looked and they added everything coming on Kickstarter into the picture, their market share was only 3%. And that was the point at which the GM was happy, because he knew that that would drive the hunger and determination and open up the possibilities for innovation, for new business models, for new routes to market, not just to think about the traditional model they've had, but a much broader context. I'm going to introduce you to some data points now to build on that story. What you see here is the first truth that we see, and this is about overperformers having much more focus on assessing and understanding market developments. So the green circle here, it says that 85% of overperformers focus on this. So the people that are growing ahead of the rest really make this a priority, and most of them do. The red is what we see from those that are in decline, so are underperformers, if you like. So they're really not making this a focus. And the point is the difference between the two. So make sure you're assessing and understanding your market developments. Walker's already talked to this. They also see, a long-term focus for overperformers is much more important. And not just a long-term focus, but they stick with it. So I think Google's a really interesting example here. They have had consistency with their big bets. Who remembers Google Glass? Everyone, right? Yeah. What can I be polite and say a flop? But it wasn't a flop because they used the technology to develop their offering. They're bringing that technology into their Maps offering. They announced that earlier this year. And actually, they announced in May that they are going to relaunch Google Glass. So they stuck the course, and it has paid off. Now, a case study here for you, which really illustrates, I think, very nicely this notion of abundant markets, is from Adobe. So when I was an advertising planner, 15 years ago, Adobe was something that the designers used. It was a PDF creation tool. Sometimes we would use it if a file was too big to send to clients. That's it. And if you told me then that Adobe was going to become a marketing solutions business from a PDF creation business, I'd be amazed. But what they've done in the acquisitions they've made, like Omniture and Marketo, which came with some controversy at the time, have really challenged and broadened the playground that they operate in and created an abundant market for them to play in. Mars Pet Care did that as well. I mean, they don't just make pet food anymore. They have a holistic pet care ecosystem with insurance and communities and all that sort of stuff. So that's really a good example of what you have to do. Now, if we get really super practical, because lots of talking, what do you actually have to do? There's lots of things you can do, but here are 3 that we would advise you to think about. For a start, shift your investment from predicting or measuring the past to predicting the future. We see that a lot, and Mark will talk to that point a little bit too. Secondly, focus your strategy on your critical growth platforms and stop doing everything else. I know it's really easy to say, to stop doing stuff, but we can perhaps talk about that a bit in our panel, how to be choiceful and decisive. And I think if you did one thing, I would say go away and think about how you can define your market so that you have no more than 3% growth. Look at it in the way that that example I gave you. Look at other things outside of the traditional way you define the category that you're in. and really broaden that. And I know Doreen talked that as part of the success of the brands, the top brands we saw this morning too. So lots of evidence, that's a good thing to do. Let's go on though to anticipative organisations and how to do that.
Oh dear. All right, so let's talk a little bit about anticipative organizations. So the myth here is that agile is basically forcing us to redefine roles and responsibilities. Now, my first job as a marketeer was at Unilever as a brand manager, and 80% of the roles would be a generalist. And you would go from brand manager to a marketing manager and onwards. And probably the same if you're in sales. You would follow a very clearly defined career path. Now, the reality today is that those roles still exist, so that's the good news. Unfortunately, they're probably up to 20% of all the roles available in marketing. I recently went, whether you go on the job site of a Unilever or Nike or whatever is your favorite company, what you would find is there's an abundant amount of jobs, so there's a scarcity of talent, but then actually the roles marketing and fulfilling are becoming increasingly specialist. So there's more and more specialist departments popping up. And then the question is, how do you make them work together? And one default could be, and who can blame them, let's clarify much better what the roles and responsibility is and who should be sitting at the table when. And actually, I have the right to sit at the table. It's not entirely working like that at overperformers. So one of the things we found there, it's much more about winning at micro battles. It's about how do we get the best 8 people for this particular job around the table? How do we get the best people to do the job as quickly as possible on the job? And there's 2 things about these micro battles which are interesting. One thing is we already talked about agile, and agile very quickly then gets synonymous of embracing a Scrum methodology or a Lean methodology. Whereas in reality, for me, agile means we want to be transparent, how we allocate a resource, we want to have high velocity, we want to have speed, we want to have flexibility, we want to have fluidity, we want all of those great things. It does not necessarily always mean we need to adopt a Scrum methodology, but what we do need is KPIs that foster collaboration. What we do need is some sort of decision-making flow that allows for full transparency, and at the end of the month, everybody knows what we're working on and where some of the bigger opportunities are, where we need to reallocate our resources to, and what we need to stop doing. The other thing is, how do we ensure we're winning the biggest battles? And Nina already referred to the Insight study we've done 2 years ago with a nice HBR article, Insights Engine. And one of the things we found is underperforming companies spend a lot of the time looking hindsight, buying data to explain their current performance. They spend a lot of their money on validation tests, just optimizing the today. But that's not going to allow you to make you win, especially listening to Jay Walker in a market where most of the existing markets are very stable. So I need to look to uncomfortable places. I need to go outside. You probably want to invest in enough foresight, in enough anticipating the trends and making some big bets. And I think it's the better companies that in their monthly flow find it in them to look, taking an abundant market view, and to really look where is those bigger opportunities. Where do we need to pick those micro battles? The other thing we found in the study is, a number of years there was an interesting study done about what's stopping you from being successful, what's stopping your growth. And the biggest thing coming out of that was internal barriers. So people, and actually with the increasing size of the company, not surprisingly, people quoting that as being the biggest barrier to growth was only increasing. So we thought that maybe it's interesting to see if overperforming companies are truly better at getting rid of those internal barriers. And lo and behold, they do. Now, what it takes has a lot to do with connections. So LinkedIn, our partner, found one interesting statistics which you can action even right now, which is that at overperforming companies, executives tend to have 5 times more connections within their own company than in underperforming companies. So whether it's across geographies, whether it's across the hierarchy, they basically executives are better connected to their total workforce. And connectivity is important because if you know people, I trust them, I can be more open, I can take more risk, I can be more collaborative. So actually being able to collaborate and to connect is an important feature. The other thing we found is that having some sort of connection software, and maybe we can talk about it later, whether it's workplace or something else, actually does help with embracing that and furthering that. Now, in a physical world, there was always a nice statistic between physical proximity, the number of meters you have to your closest colleague you need to work with, and let's say the quality of the interaction. There was a very steep relationship. The moment that goes beyond 4 or 5 meters, it dramatically plummets. And you would say in a social day and age, in a digital connected day and age, that no longer holds true. Unfortunately, the reverse is true. If you would look at the statistics, is that the people that sitting closest to you in your workplace, you would most likely also have most connections with and most interactivity with on any social device. So whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook, the people you're sitting closest to are also the ones you actually communicate most with on social media. So actually it does matter how you configure your workspace. So up to you whether you still want to keep your functional silos, functional departments, but maybe you're better off creating collaborative spaces and mixing up the teams for better collaboration. Not surprisingly, e-commerce and requiring the integration of marketing and sales. And basically overperforming companies being better at making that integration happen. Now we see a lot of service companies, a lot of startups, that they're able to organize around consumers and customers. Unfortunately, for CPG companies, that's a little bit more difficult. With physical channels, physical products, it's not always easy to organize your whole team around specific customer and consumer groups you want to cater to. But then e-commerce is probably the one area where you first and foremost want to prioritize to make that integration between marketing and sales happen. Because what might be traditional marketer's job to talk about awareness, driving traffic, or a traditional sales job to really convert, when it comes to a direct-to-consumer, there is no logic to what happens when. So it really needs to follow in unison, and consumer from one moment can be a buyer the next moment, going back to an influencer the next moment. So you really need to figure out how to make that integration happen. One company we briefly want to talk about as a case study here is Haier. So Haier is a Chinese company, about 40 billion in revenue, about 70,000 employees worldwide. For the 9th consecutive year, the number 1 in domestic appliances. So by all means, a really, really big company, except for the fact that it isn't. Because the whole company is organized in entrepreneurial units. So what they really pride themselves is being very close to the customer. Everybody has to be close to the customer, and entrepreneurialism. So their CEO, who's been there since the 80s, he started out as one of the factory managers, and in the meantime has gone for 4 different reorganizations, transitions, and he would probably like to see himself, and even quoted that, to see himself as a sort of chief organizational architect. In his most recent sort of reorganization, they really put about, let's really embrace digital and make the maximum use of that. One thing it allowed them to do is create basically units of 10, 12 people owning a business, truly owning a business. They would be set a target. The data is free, available to everybody. It would basically recognize what the growth rate on average is for the product that team is managing, and would give them a target probably somewhere between 4 times to 10 times the average growth rate. So the smaller your size, the bigger that growth target. The good thing is that the remuneration you would get from it, not for yourself, but for the whole team, is heavily tied into it. So the more you overperform, ultimately it allows you to basically take a stake and divide all the profits of that company among your workforce. The next thing is, managing with a team of 10, you then need to negotiate and put out for tender all the services you need. Whether it's manufacturing, whether it's HR, you basically put it out for tender. There's about 1,500 of these small units in China, and you basically work with the one that best suits your needs. That also means that forces each of those units constantly to be innovative, to be the best, because otherwise they go out of business, and there's nothing to save you. The other funny fact I found is that the business performance of all these units is highly transparent. So literally, if you're an aspiring CEO, you see an underperforming unit, you can pitch for that managing director job to that team, and it would literally replace the existing managing director by somebody new, put you in charge of that unit. It's up to the people in that team to take that decision. Now, with that amount of growth rate, you got to be entrepreneurial. You got to find new ways. So the good news is there's a data system that would allow you to access all the consumer data available throughout the company. It would basically put you in touch with any Chinese consumer or anybody who ever came across a Haier product. Would give you insight into the tensions they have with the existing product, would allow you in a very agile way to get constant consumer feedback and response to whatever product you would be developing. Now the product you would be developing, you put actually out a brief for people to pitch upon, which could be from within the organization, but it could also be from outside. There's quite a big open innovation platform. So I found it a fascinating way to basically tie everybody's incentive to customers, but also to incentivize everybody to be entrepreneurial all the time. Some key actions. I think it's probably false to make a distinction between either a big corporate or an entrepreneur. Like Haier, you probably want to have entrepreneurs throughout your organization. Ideally, in every department, in every unit, you want your people to be entrepreneurs. I think the Haier CEO even said, if a day without change is basically putting us one day behind competition. So you constantly want to challenge yourself and be actually on the edge. There's nothing wrong with clarifying roles and responsibilities, but probably it needs to go with some guiding principles on how you create fluidity and transparency. So the moment that starts to become stifling bureaucracy, you're then at the wrong end. So it has to go together with some sort of way that allows you this fluidity, this flexibility, this transparency, what you're really after, some of those guiding principles. And finally, really think of your organization as an abundant market of amazing teams, and it's the only thing it takes for you is to put the right teams together to perform on the right task. Now, for those of you that lead such a team, that might actually then bring specific requirements on leadership.
Yeah, thank you. So this is just a way to segue really into the panel and for me to introduce our brilliant panel members. But a byproduct of this study that we did was actually to understand the characteristics of leaders of overperforming businesses. So the leadership characteristics that we all have a responsibility to live and role model and develop in those that work for us. And these are those 4 characteristics: courage, passion, ability to empower, and to be humble, to have humility. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce 2 clients of ours that actually are going to come and join a lively discussion, I think, about how on earth this actually comes to life in reality.